elderly mother visited her rich daughter with the hope of being able to see her again. But when she opened the door, she saw something that left her desperate, and adjusted the strap of her worn handbag as she sat stiffly on the bus seat. The rhythmic hum of the engine was a small comfort against the knot of anxiety growing in her chest. Outside the fogged window, sprawling suburban neighborhoods rushed by, each house looking larger and more extravagant than the last. She gripped the handle of her bag, feeling the edges of an old photograph inside, a photo of Claire, her daughter, taken decades ago. It was one of Anne's most cherished memories, a reminder of a time when they had been closer. The bus jolted to a stop, and Anne steadied herself as she stood up. A voice announced the destination, Westfield Drive. Her stop. She stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, clutching her bag tightly. The street was lined with immaculate houses, each boasting manicured lawns and gleaming cars parked in the driveways. It was a world away from the modest home she had left behind. Anne's eyes searched for the house number Claire had written in her last letter. When she finally found it, her breath caught. It wasn't just a house, it was a mansion. Towering pillars framed a grand entrance, and the windows glinted like polished diamonds in the sunlight. She lingered at the edge of the driveway, feeling a strange mix of pride and unease. This was Claire's world now, a world Anne had never been a part of. With trembling hands, Anne adjusted her scarf and began the walk up the driveway. Her shoes clicked faintly against the pristine pavement. Each step felt heavier than the last as memories of their strained relationship surfaced. It had been years since she and Claire had spoken face to face. Letters had replaced phone calls, and distance had replaced closeness. Anne told herself that this visit was overdue, that it was time to bridge the gap. Reaching the door, Anne hesitated. Would Claire welcome her? She glanced down at her reflection in the polished brass door knocker, suddenly aware of her plain coat and graying hair. Anne raised her hand to knock, but her courage faltered. She almost turned back, but the weight of the photograph in her bag grounded her. This wasn't about appearances. It was about family. Gathering her resolve, she knocked. The sound echoed faintly, swallowed by the stillness of the neighborhood. A moment passed, and then another. Anne's heart sank. What if Claire wasn't home? What if? The door creaked open. Anne's lips parted, ready to greet her daughter, but the words died in her throat. A stranger stood in the doorway, a woman in her late 20s, dressed in scrubs and holding a clipboard. The woman's face softened with a polite smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. And blinked, caught off guard. I'm looking for Claire. Claire Matthews. This is her house, isn't it? The woman tilted her head slightly. Yes, it is. And you are? And hesitated. I'm her mother. The woman's expression shifted, sympathy mingling with curiosity. Come in, she said, stepping aside. And stepped into the house, her senses immediately overwhelmed. The air smelled faintly of lavender and antiseptic. The polished floors gleamed under soft lighting, and the walls were adorned with artwork that seemed more decorative than personal. The grandeur of the house only deepened the chasm and felt between her life and her daughter's. Wait here, the woman said, gesturing toward a sleek, modern sofa. And perched on the edge of the seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her eyes scanned the room for signs of Claire, photos, personal touches, but there were none. It was beautiful but impersonal, as if the house was a stage rather than a home. Footsteps echoed from the staircase. Anne's heart raced. She looked up, expecting to see Claire descending the grand steps, but instead, the nurse returned. Claire will be down in a moment, the nurse said gently. There was something in her tone, something cautious, as if she were preparing Anne for what was to come. Anne nodded, but her mind buzzed with questions. Why was a nurse answering Claire's door? Why did the house feel so hollow? And most importantly, what had happened to her daughter? The sound of approaching footsteps broke her thoughts. Anne turned toward the staircase, clutching her bag tightly. The photograph inside felt heavier now, its edges pressing into her palm. She took a deep breath as a figure appeared at the top of the stairs. The sound of heels clicking against the marble staircase echoed through the expansive living room. Anne's eyes locked onto the figure descending the steps. It was Claire, her daughter, her only child. But something was different. Claire's usually confident stride was hesitant, her gaze unfocused as she gripped the railing for support. "Claire?" Anne's voice wavered, her hands tightening around her bag. Claire paused halfway down the staircase, her expression blank. Her eyes scanned Anne's face, but there was no flicker of recognition. Instead, Claire turned her head slightly toward the nurse, as if seeking clarification. "Who?" Claire began, her voice soft and uncertain. Her gaze shifted back to Anne, her brows furrowing in confusion. "Who is she?" Anne's breath caught in her chest. It felt as though the ground beneath her had shifted. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Her daughter didn't recognize her. The thought hit her like a blow. The nurse, standing nearby, stepped forward gently. "This is your mother, Claire. Anne Matthews. She's come to see you." Claire's lips parted slightly, her brows knitting further together. She stared at Anne for a long moment, as if trying to place her. Finally, she murmured, "Mother." The word was spoken as though it belonged to someone else, foreign and unfamiliar. Anne forced a smile, though her heart was breaking. "Yes, sweetheart. It's me. It's Mom." Claire's gaze dropped, and she took a hesitant step back. I don't remember," she whispered, almost to herself. The nurse placed a reassuring hand on Claire's arm. "It's okay, Claire. Why don't we sit down?" She led Claire to a nearby armchair and motioned for Anne to sit on the couch. The distance between them felt vast, an unspoken barrier neither knew how to cross. Anne swallowed hard and glanced at the nurse, silently pleading for answers. The nurse seemed to understand and crouched slightly, speaking in a calm, measured tone. "Mrs. Matthews, Claire is experiencing progressive memory loss. It's due to a condition called early-onset Alzheimer's disease." She paused, letting the words settle. "She was diagnosed about a year ago." Anne's breath hitched, and her grip on her bag tightened. "Alzheimer's?" The word tasted bitter in her mouth. Her mind raced with disbelief. Claire, her vibrant and ambitious daughter, battling a disease that robbed her of herself? It seemed impossible. The nurse continued, her voice steady but laced with empathy. "Her condition has been progressing rapidly. Some days are better than others, but her long-term memory is affected the most. She struggles to recognize faces, even those of people she loves." And blinked back the sting of tears and turned her gaze to Claire. Her daughter sat quietly, her hands fidgeting in her lap as she stared at the floor. It was as if she were a shadow of the woman Anne remembered, a woman who had once been so full of life and determination. She doesn't remember me?" Anne's voice broke, the question hanging in the air like a plea. The nurse hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "She may not remember everything right now, but memories can be triggered. Sometimes familiar faces, objects, or stories can help." And nodded, though her heart felt heavy with the weight of the revelation. She shifted her focus back to Claire, determined to find a connection, no matter how small. "Claire," and began softly. "It's me, Mom. Remember? When you were little, I used to make pancakes for you every Sunday morning. You always insisted on putting too much syrup on yours." She chuckled lightly, hoping to spark a flicker of recognition. Claire looked up, her eyes meeting Anne's. For a moment, something stirred, a faint glimmer of a memory, but it quickly faded. She shook her head slightly. I don't remember," she said, her voice barely audible. Anne's smile faltered, but she didn't let the sadness show. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out the photograph she had carried all this way. It was a picture of Claire as a child, standing proudly in front of a school science project. And held it out, her hand trembling. "Do you remember this, sweetheart?" Anne asked, her voice filled with quiet hope. "You won first place in the science fair that year. You were so proud of yourself." Claire stared at the photograph, her brow furrowing. Her fingers brushed the edge of the picture, but she shook her head again, her eyes clouded with frustration. "No," she whispered, her voice tinged with sadness. "I don't." And felt her heart sink, but she refused to give up. "It's okay," she said softly, placing the photograph on the coffee table. "We'll figure this out together." The nurse stood and gave a reassuring nod. "It'll take time," she said quietly. "But your presence here is a good first step." And nodded, though her mind churned with emotions, grief, determination, and a glimmer of hope. She looked at Claire, her heart aching for the daughter she had once known, and vowed silently to stay. This was her chance to rebuild their bond, one fragile moment at a time. The early evening sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting golden hues across the polished floors. And sat alone in the living room after Claire had retreated upstairs, guided gently by the nurse. The photograph Anne had placed on the coffee table stared back at her, a reminder of the fragile bridge she was trying to build. The house was eerily quiet. It felt more like a showroom than a home, with its pristine surfaces and carefully curated decor. Anne's gaze wandered around the room, searching for something, anything, that spoke of Claire's personality. But there were no personal touches, no framed family photos or keepsakes. The absence was like a void, amplifying the sense of loss Anne already felt. Unable to sit still, she stood and began to explore. She moved through the spacious kitchen with its gleaming appliances and into a hallway lined with closed doors. One of them caught her eye. It was slightly ajar, revealing a small study within. Curiosity tugged at her, and she stepped inside. The study was the first room that felt different. It was less polished, more lived in. Papers and books were scattered across a desk, and a few potted plants sat on the windowsill, their leaves slightly wilted. Anne's fingers brushed over the spines of the books as she walked to the desk. Among the clutter, she noticed a small stack of photographs bound with a thin ribbon. Carefully, she untied the ribbon and began flipping through the photos. Each one brought a rush of memories. There was a picture of Claire on her graduation day, smiling proudly in her cap and gown. Another showed Claire as a young girl, building a sandcastle on the beach. Anne's heart clenched as she realized how many moments they had shared, moments Claire might never recall again. As Anne sorted through the photographs, she found an album tucked away on a lower shelf. Pulling it out, she opened the cover and was met with a flood of memories. The album was filled with pictures from Claire's childhood, birthday parties, family vacations, even mundane moments like baking cookies in their small kitchen. Anne smiled through tears as she traced her fingers over the images. One photo in particular caught her attention. It showed Claire as a child, sitting at a wooden table, concentrating on a crayon drawing. Anne remembered that day vividly. It had been a rare weekend off from work, and they had spent the entire afternoon coloring and laughing. She had forgotten how much Claire loved to draw. Maybe she remembers this, and murmured to herself. A voice behind her startled her. She used to look at that album often. And turned to see the nurse standing in the doorway, her expression gentle. "I think it gave her some comfort in the beginning," the nurse continued. But as her condition progressed, it became harder for her. Sometimes, not remembering is easier than struggling to hold on. And closed the album carefully, her chest tightening with a mix of sadness and resolve. "I don't want to give up on her," she said softly. "There's still a part of her in there. I can feel it." The nurse nodded. "You're right. Memory loss doesn't erase who she is. Sometimes, it just takes a little help to bring pieces of the past to the surface." And clung to those words. She carried the album back to the living room and placed it next to the photograph on the table. She would use it as a tool, a way to reach Claire, if not through her mind, then through her heart. Later that evening, Anne found herself in the kitchen, making tea. The house felt too big, too quiet. She thought about the tiny apartment she had raised Claire in, where every noise echoed with life. She missed those days, even the hard ones. She missed the version of Claire who had once filled the silence with laughter. As she returned to the living room, the sound of soft footsteps drew her attention. Claire stood in the doorway, her face shadowed in the dim light. Her eyes fell on the album, and she hesitated. "What's that?" Claire asked, her voice distant but curious. "It's something I thought you might like to see," Anne replied, gesturing toward the couch. "Would you sit with me for a while?" Claire approached slowly, her movements tentative. She sat down, her gaze fixed on the album, and opened it to the page with the crayon drawing. "Do you remember this?" she asked gently. Claire studied the picture, her brow furrowing. For a moment, there was silence. Then she shook her head. "No," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "I don't." And placed a hand on Claire's, steadying her. "That's okay," she said softly. "We'll start fresh. Together." Claire looked at her, and though her eyes were clouded with confusion, there was a flicker of something else, trust. It was small, but it was enough for Anne to hold on to. The next morning, Anne woke early, her body still adjusting to the unfamiliar bed in Claire's guest room. She dressed quickly and went downstairs, finding the house just as quiet as the night before. The weight of the task ahead sat heavily on her shoulders. Though she had managed a brief connection with Claire the previous evening, it felt tenuous, as if the fragile thread could snap at any moment. She decided to start the day by making breakfast, something simple, something familiar. Searching through the sleek, unfamiliar kitchen, Anne found a carton of eggs and a loaf of bread. The toaster was a high-tech contraption she could barely figure out, but eventually, the aroma of warm toast and scrambled eggs began to fill the house. As Anne set the table, she glanced toward the staircase, hoping Claire would appear. Minutes stretched into longer moments, and just as Anne was beginning to wonder if she should check on her, Claire's soft footsteps echoed down the hall. She appeared in the doorway, her face pale and hesitant, her hair slightly disheveled. "Good morning," Anne greeted with a warm smile, though her voice was laced with caution. Claire blinked at her, her gaze moving to the table and then back to Anne. "I didn't know anyone was here," she murmured, her tone distant. Anne's chest tightened, but she forced herself to keep smiling. "I made breakfast. Come and sit down." Claire hesitated, her hand gripping the edge of the doorway. There was a flicker of something in her expression, confusion, perhaps, or resistance. Slowly, she moved to the table and sat down. And placed a plate in front of her, watching for any sign of recognition or comfort. "You always loved scrambled eggs," Anne said softly, sliding into the chair across from Claire. "When you were little, you'd mix in so much ketchup that they turned red." Claire looked down at the eggs, her fork hovering uncertainly. "I don't remember that," she said quietly, her voice almost apologetic. And felt the familiar pang of disappointment but quickly masked it. "That's all right," she replied gently. "We'll just make new memories." Claire picked at her food in silence, and Anne fought the urge to fill the void with conversation. The distance between them felt palpable, like an invisible wall that neither of them knew how to break down. Anne's mind raced with ideas, stories to tell, questions to ask, but she feared pushing too hard and driving Claire further away. After breakfast, Claire retreated to the living room, where she sat by the window, staring out at the perfectly trimmed lawn. And followed, keeping a respectful distance. She watched as Claire fidgeted with her hands, her expression vacant. "Do you ever feel like you're trapped?" Claire asked suddenly, her voice startling in the silence. And blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Claire didn't look at her. "Like you're stuck inside your own mind, but it's not really yours anymore. Like someone's locked all the doors, and you can't find the key." Anne's throat tightened. She crossed the room and sat beside Claire, her heart aching at the vulnerability in her daughter's voice. "I can't imagine how hard this must be for you," she said softly. "But I'm here now. Whatever doors are locked, we'll try to open them together." Claire turned to her, her eyes searching Anne's face. There was a flicker of recognition, fleeting, but real. "You're my mother," she said, almost as if testing the words. And nodded, her voice steady but tender. "Yes, I am." Claire looked away, her shoulders slumping. "I don't feel like I know you." The words cut deeply, but Anne held herself together. "That's okay," she said after a moment. We have time. I'll help you get to know me again." Claire's lips pressed into a thin line, and she gave a faint nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Anne to see that the wall between them, while still standing, wasn't impenetrable. Later that day, Anne found herself back in the study, sifting through more of Claire's belongings. She discovered a small wooden box tucked away in a drawer. Inside were trinkets from Claire's childhood, a pressed flower, a ribbon from a school competition, and a tiny charm bracelet that Anne had given her for her 10th birthday. Anne held the bracelet in her hands, memories flooding back. She decided to show it to Claire, hoping it might spark something. When Anne presented it to her, Claire studied it intently. She ran her fingers over the tiny charms, her brow furrowing. "I used to wear this," she murmured. "Didn't I?" Anne's heart leapt. "Yes, you did. You never wanted to take it off." Claire looked up, her eyes meeting Anne's. For the first time, there was a faint smile on her lips. "I think I remember that." Anne smiled back, her chest swelling with cautious hope. One small piece of the past had found its way back, and it was enough to keep her moving forward. The house was quiet again that evening, save for the occasional hum of the heater kicking on. Anne sat in the study, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of a small, worn diary she had discovered while tidying. The cover was plain and unadorned, its edges frayed from years of handling. It looked out of place in Claire's meticulously curated home, and Anne hesitated to open it. The diary felt deeply personal, a window into Claire's thoughts that Anne wasn't sure she had the right to see. But the words written inside might help her understand what Claire had been through in the years they had been apart. Finally, with a deep breath, Anne opened the first page. The handwriting was familiar yet slightly rushed, as if Claire had poured her emotions onto the paper without overthinking. The first entry was dated years ago, long before Anne knew anything about Claire's illness. "Sometimes, I wonder if my mother ever really knew me. She was always so busy, so caught up in work or other responsibilities. I don't think she ever realized how much I needed her." Anne's breath caught. She read the words again, letting them sink in. A pang of guilt hit her chest as she remembered all the nights she had come home late from work, exhausted and distracted. Claire had always been independent, but had she mistaken that independence for a lack of need? She flipped to another page, her hands trembling. "The day I graduated, I looked out into the crowd, searching for her face. When I didn't see her, I told myself it didn't matter. But it did. It always did." And closed her eyes, her heart aching. She remembered that day, how she had been stuck at the office, unable to leave in time to attend Claire's graduation. She had told herself Claire would understand, that it wasn't a big deal. But clearly, it had been. Entry after entry revealed the depth of Claire's pain. There were moments of anger, confusion, and longing woven throughout. And could see her daughter's struggles unfolding on the pages, her feelings of abandonment, her desire for connection, and her attempts to make peace with the distance between them. Near the middle of the diary, one entry stood out. "I just wanted her to say she was proud of me. Just once. I think I would have been okay if I had heard it, even once." Tears slipped down Anne's cheeks as she clutched the diary to her chest. How many times had she thought those very words in her heart but never said them aloud? How often had she assumed Claire already knew how much she loved her? And spent the rest of the night reading the diary, each page deepening her resolve. Claire's struggles weren't just the result of her illness, they were wounds that had festered long before the disease took hold. And couldn't change the past, but she could fight for the present. The next morning, Anne found Claire sitting by the window, her gaze fixed on the garden outside. The album and the charm bracelet lay on the coffee table beside her, untouched but not discarded. Anne approached quietly, the diary tucked under her arm. "Good morning, sweetheart," Anne said gently. Claire turned her head, her expression neutral. "Morning." Anne hesitated, then sat down across from her. "I found something of yours," she said, holding up the diary. "It was in the study." Claire's brow furrowed slightly as she looked at the small book. "I don't remember that." "I thought that might be the case," Anne said, her voice soft. But I read it. I hope you don't mind. Claire's eyes narrowed slightly. You read it? Yes, and admitted, her tone steady but vulnerable. And I'm so sorry, Claire. For everything. Claire tilted her head, confusion flickering in her eyes. Sorry for what? For not being there when you needed me, and said, her voice breaking slightly. For not saying the things I should have said. You were right, I didn't always see you the way I should have. And I can't change that now. But I want you to know how proud I am of you. Always. Claire stared at her, her expression unreadable. Then she looked at the diary, her fingers brushing its cover. I wrote that, she asked softly. And nodded. You did. Claire opened the diary, flipping through its pages. She stopped at a random entry, her eyes scanning the words. I don't remember writing this, she murmured. But I feel like it's true. And leaned forward, her hand resting gently on Claire's. It is true. And I need you to know that I hear you, Claire. I see you. And I'm so sorry it took me this long to say it. Claire's gaze lifted, meeting Anne's. Her lips trembled slightly, and for the first time, Anne saw tears forming in her daughter's eyes. It's okay, Claire whispered, her voice breaking. You're here now. And squeezed Claire's hand, a sense of hope blooming in her chest. The past couldn't be rewritten, but maybe, just maybe, they could start anew. The afternoon sun cast warm rays through the large windows, illuminating the living room in a soft glow. And sat quietly on the edge of the couch, watching Claire as she flipped through the pages of the diary. Though her movements were hesitant, her fingers lingered on certain entries, as if some part of her was searching for a connection. And didn't interrupt, she knew Claire needed time. After a while, Claire closed the diary and set it aside, her expression distant but calm. And took the moment of stillness to try a different approach. There was something she had been holding on to, an old memory, perhaps trivial to some, but deeply meaningful to her. Claire, and began softly, breaking the silence. Do you remember the song I used to sing to you when you couldn't sleep? Claire tilted her head, a faint crease forming between her brows. A song, she echoed, her tone uncertain. And smiled gently. Yes. It was your favorite. You'd always ask me to sing it again and again, even when your eyes were already closed. She chuckled, though her voice wavered with emotion. You'd hum along with me until you finally drifted off. Claire shook her head slowly. I don't think I remember, she said, her voice tinged with frustration. That's okay, and reassured her, leaning forward slightly. Maybe if I sing it, it will come back to you. Claire hesitated, her eyes searching Anne's face as if weighing whether to let her mother proceed. After a moment, she gave a slight nod. And took a deep breath, steadying herself. It had been years since she'd sung aloud, and her voice was rougher with age, but the words came back to her like an old friend. She began to sing softly, her voice carrying the familiar melody through the quiet room. Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird. The song hung in the air, delicate and fragile, like a thread connecting the past to the present. Anne's voice faltered slightly as emotion threatened to overwhelm her, but she pushed through, determined to finish. She watched Claire's face closely, searching for any sign of recognition. At first, Claire's expression remained blank, her gaze fixed on her hands folded in her lap. But as Anne continued, something began to shift. Claire's eyes softened, and her lips parted slightly, as if the melody was stirring something deep within her. By the time Anne reached the final line, Claire was humming faintly along, almost instinctively. And stopped singing, her heart pounding as she asked, Does it feel familiar now? Claire didn't answer right away. Her fingers tapped lightly against the armrest of the couch, matching the rhythm of the song. Finally, she looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. I think I used to know that song. You did, Anne said, her smile widening. I used to sing it to you every night when you were little. Claire's gaze shifted to the window, her eyes distant. It's strange, she murmured. I can't remember the words, but I feel like I know it in my heart. And felt a lump form in her throat. That's because it's part of you, Claire, she said gently. Just like it's part of me. Claire turned to her, her expression softening. There was a flicker of emotion in her eyes, something fragile yet undeniable. Can you sing it again? She asked. And nodded, her heart swelling. Of course. She sang the lullaby once more, this time slower, savoring every note. Claire closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the couch, and began to hum along again. The melody seemed to wrap around them both, filling the room with a warmth that words could never fully convey. When and finished, Claire opened her eyes and looked at her mother. It's a nice song, she said simply, but there was a faint smile tugging at her lips. It's our song, Anne replied softly. It always has been. For the first time in years, Anne felt as though the gap between them was beginning to close. It wasn't a full reconciliation, not yet, but it was a start. And for Anne, that was enough to keep going. The silence that followed wasn't heavy or uncomfortable. It was peaceful, a shared moment of understanding. Anne reached over and gently placed her hand over Claire's. Claire didn't pull away. Together, they sat quietly, the song lingering in the air like a promise unspoken but deeply felt. The days seemed to blend together as Anne continued her efforts to reconnect with Claire. Each moment felt like a careful balancing act. Too much pressure could push Claire away, but doing too little might let the distance between them grow again. And clung to the small victories, the moments when Claire hummed along to the lullaby or smiled faintly at a memory sparked by an old photograph. But progress wasn't linear. Some days, Claire was withdrawn and quiet, retreating into herself, and Anne struggled to break through the invisible walls of confusion and frustration that her daughter seemed to build around herself. One afternoon, Anne decided to try a new approach. She had found an old sketchbook while going through Claire's belongings and remembered how much her daughter used to love drawing as a child. The pages were filled with pencil sketches, flowers, landscapes, and even a few portraits. Anne smiled as she flipped through the drawings, marveling at Claire's talent. Claire was sitting by the window again, her usual spot. Her gaze was distant, her fingers idly tracing the edge of the armrest. Anne approached her gently, the sketchbook in hand. Claire, she said softly, holding out the book, look what I found. Claire glanced at the sketchbook but didn't take it. What is it? She asked, her voice flat. It's your old sketchbook, Anne explained, sitting beside her. You used to spend hours drawing. You were so good at it. Claire's brow furrowed as she finally reached for the book, her fingers brushing over the cover. She opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the drawings. For a moment, Anne thought she saw a flicker of recognition, but it quickly faded. I don't remember this, Claire said, her voice tinged with frustration. She flipped through a few more pages, her movements growing more agitated. I don't remember any of it. And placed a reassuring hand on Claire's arm. That's okay, sweetheart. It's not about remembering everything. It's about how it made you feel. Claire's hands clenched the edges of the sketchbook, her frustration boiling over. How am I supposed to feel anything when I don't even know who I am anymore? She snapped, her voice rising. I don't remember drawing these. I don't remember the song. I don't remember you. And froze, the words hitting her like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to respond, but Claire wasn't finished. I hate this, Claire continued, her voice breaking. I hate not knowing. I hate feeling like a stranger in my own life. Tears welled in Anne's eyes, but she held them back. This wasn't about her pain, it was about Claire's. She leaned closer, her voice calm but firm. Claire, I know this is hard. I can't imagine how overwhelming it must be, but you're not alone. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Claire shook her head, the tears in her eyes mirroring Anne's. What's the point? I'll just forget again tomorrow. Anne's heart ached at the despair in her daughter's voice. She reached out and took Claire's hands in hers, holding them tightly. Even if you forget, I'll still be here. Every day, I'll remind you. Every day, we'll start again, if that's what it takes. For a moment, Claire stared at her, the walls around her heart seemingly insurmountable. Then she let out a shaky breath and looked down at the sketchbook in her lap. "Why did this have to happen to me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. And didn't have an answer to that question, and she knew that no words could truly ease Claire's pain. Instead, she wrapped her arms around her daughter, pulling her close. Claire resisted at first, but then she leaned into the embrace, her body trembling with quiet sobs. They stayed like that for a long time, the silence punctuated only by Claire's uneven breaths. And stroked her daughter's hair, whispering softly, "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here." Later that evening, and found herself in the kitchen, staring out the window as the sun dipped below the horizon. She felt drained, her emotions raw. The outburst had been painful, but it had also been a breakthrough. For the first time, Claire had opened up about her fears, her anger, and her sorrow. And knew it wasn't a resolution, but it was a step toward healing. The nurse entered quietly, offering a small smile. "Rough day?" she asked. And nodded, her voice heavy. "But I think it was an important one." The nurse's smile widened slightly. "Sometimes, breaking down is the first step to building back up." And mulled over those words as she prepared a cup of tea, her thoughts lingering on Claire. She knew the journey ahead would be filled with more moments like this, moments of heartbreak and struggle. But she also knew she wouldn't face them alone. That night, as she peeked into Claire's room, she found her daughter asleep, the sketchbook resting on the nightstand. One of the pages was open, a sketch of a young girl with bright eyes and an infectious smile. It was Claire as a child, drawn with a tenderness that only she could capture. And smiled softly, a glimmer of hope settling in her chest. Tomorrow was another day, and they would face it together. The next morning, and woke with a sense of renewed purpose. She had spent the night reflecting on Claire's outburst, understanding that her daughter's frustration wasn't directed at her but at the cruel reality of her illness. Claire was navigating a life that felt like it was slipping through her fingers, and wanted to give her something solid, something that could anchor her to the love they shared. She sat at the small desk in the guest room, a blank sheet of paper in front of her. The pen in her hand trembled slightly as she thought about what to say. Words had never been Anne's strength, she had always shown her love through actions. But now, with Claire's memory so fragmented, and realized how important it was to put her feelings into words that could remain, even if her presence someday couldn't. And began to write. "My dearest Claire. I've made many mistakes as your mother. I was so caught up in work and responsibilities that I missed moments I can never get back. For that, I am deeply sorry. But I need you to know how much I love you, how proud I am of the woman you've become, and how grateful I am for every moment we've had together, even the difficult ones. You've always been strong, even when you didn't feel it. I see that strength in you every day, even now. I know you're angry and scared, and I wish I could take that pain away from you. But please remember this, you are not alone. I am here, and I will never stop loving you, no matter what happens. You are my greatest joy, Claire. My beautiful, talented, resilient daughter. And I am so proud of you. With all my love. Mom." And folded the letter carefully and slipped it into an envelope. Her hands were still trembling as she sealed it, but she felt a sense of peace. This letter was a piece of her heart, a message Claire could hold on to, even on the hardest days. She found Claire sitting in the living room, staring absently at the charm bracelet Anne had shown her days earlier. The soft clink of the charms filled the quiet room as Claire twisted the bracelet between her fingers. "Good morning," and greeted warmly, sitting down beside her. Claire glanced at her, her expression neutral. "Morning," she murmured. And reached into her pocket and pulled out the letter. "I wrote something for you," she said, holding it out. Claire looked at the envelope suspiciously. "What is it?" "It's a letter," Anne explained. "For you to read whenever you want." Claire hesitated, her fingers hovering over the envelope before taking it. She stared at it for a moment, her brow furrowing. "Why did you write me a letter?" And smiled softly. Because sometimes it's easier to say what's in your heart when you write it down. Claire seemed to consider this, then slowly opened the envelope. She unfolded the letter and began to read, her eyes scanning the page. And watched nervously, unsure how Claire would react. At first, Claire's face remained unreadable. But as she continued reading, her lips began to tremble, and tears pooled in her eyes. By the time she reached the end, a single tear slipped down her cheek. She lowered the letter and looked at it, her expression a mixture of sadness and gratitude. "Did you mean all of this?" Claire asked, her voice shaky. "Every word," Anne replied, her own voice thick with emotion. "I wish I had said it all sooner, but I mean it now." Claire looked back at the letter, her fingers tracing the edges. "I don't remember everything," she said quietly. "But I feel like I know what you mean. Like I can feel it." And reached out and placed a hand over Claire's. "That's all that matters." Claire nodded, her tears falling freely now. She leaned forward and wrapped her arms around Anne, holding her tightly. And froze for a moment, overwhelmed by the unexpected embrace, before wrapping her own arms around her daughter. "I'm scared," Claire whispered against Anne's shoulder. "What if I forget again?" And stroked Claire's hair gently. "Then I'll remind you," she said. "Every day, if I have to. I'll remind you how much I love you." They sat like that for a long time, the letter resting on the coffee table beside them. It was a moment Anne knew she would carry in her heart forever, a moment where the barriers between them fell away, leaving only love. That evening, Anne found the letter back on Claire's nightstand, carefully folded and placed next to the sketchbook. Seeing it there, she felt a renewed sense of hope. Even if Claire's memory failed her, the love between them would remain, written in ink and etched into their hearts. The crisp morning air carried the scent of freshly cut grass as Anne stood at the edge of the garden, surveying the neatly manicured flower beds. Despite the perfection of the landscaping, the garden felt lifeless to her, more like a showcase than a place of comfort. She glanced at Claire, who sat nearby in a wicker chair, staring blankly at the empty flower pots on the table. And had spent the evening planning something new, something that could give Claire a sense of purpose. The idea had come to her as she thought about the sketches Claire used to draw, always full of life, brimming with color. If Claire couldn't find the pieces of her past, maybe she could create something new, something to remind her of the beauty she still carried within. And picked up a trowel and a small bag of soil, then turned to Claire with a warm smile. "How about we plant a garden today?" Claire frowned, her gaze flickering between Anne and the pots. "A garden?" "Yes," Anne said, her enthusiasm unwavering. "We can plant flowers together. Something colorful, just like the ones you used to sketch." Claire's frown deepened, her fingers tightening on the armrests of her chair. "I don't remember planting anything." "That's okay," Anne said gently. "It doesn't matter if you remember. We'll start fresh, together." Claire hesitated, her expression uncertain. "I don't know if I can do it." "You can," Anne reassured her. "And I'll be right here to help." Reluctantly, Claire nodded, and Anne's heart lifted. She brought over a small tray of flower seedlings and placed it on the table. Together, they examined the plants, vivid marigolds, delicate pansies, and bright petunias. And showed Claire how to handle the soil, letting her feel its cool texture between her fingers. At first, Claire's movements were hesitant, her hands clumsy as she tried to scoop soil into the pots. But as the minutes passed, she began to relax. The repetitive motion seemed to calm her, and a faint glimmer of focus returned to her eyes. "Look at this one," Anne said, holding up a tiny pansy with purple and yellow petals. "Isn't it beautiful?" Claire studied the flower for a moment, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "It's pretty," she admitted. "You always liked purple," and added, recalling how Claire's childhood bedroom had been painted a soft lavender. "It's a happy color." As they worked side by side, and shared little stories from the past, about the time Claire had tried to grow sunflowers in the backyard of their old apartment, or how she'd once sketched an entire field of wildflowers during a family picnic. Some stories made Claire smile, while others brought only a flicker of recognition, but and didn't mind. She was planting seeds of her own, nurturing memories that might someday take root. After a while, Claire seemed to forget her earlier reluctance. She carefully pressed a marigold seedling into the soil, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Am I doing this right?" she asked. "You're doing wonderfully," Anne said, her voice brimming with pride. "See? I told you you could do it." They continued until all the pots were filled with bright, colorful flowers. The once empty table now looked like a celebration of life, each bloom a testament to their shared effort. Claire sat back, her hands smudged with soil, and looked at their work with a sense of quiet satisfaction. "It's nice," Claire said, her voice soft. "I like it." And reached over and gently squeezed Claire's hand. "You did this, Claire. You made something beautiful." Claire's gaze lingered on the flowers, and for the first time in days, and saw a lightness in her expression. "Can we water them now?" "Of course," Anne said, retrieving a small watering can. She handed it to Claire, who carefully poured water over each pot, her movements deliberate and gentle. As the water seeped into the soil, Anne felt a deep sense of peace. The garden wasn't just a collection of flowers, it was a symbol of growth, of hope. It was a reminder that even in the face of uncertainty, life could still flourish. When they finished, Claire stood beside Anne, her eyes scanning the vibrant display. "Will they grow bigger?" she asked. "They will," Anne replied, smiling. "With a little care, they'll keep growing." Claire nodded, her lips curving into a small but genuine smile. "I'd like that." And wrapped an arm around Claire's shoulders, pulling her close. Together, they stood in the sunlight, watching the garden they had created, a garden that, like their bond, was fragile but full of promise. The morning air was crisp and filled with the faint scent of the flowers Claire and Anne had planted just a few days before. And stood by the kitchen window, watching Claire as she knelt by the garden, watering the flowers with a quiet focus. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and careful, as if tending to the blooms gave her a sense of purpose. And smiled softly, grateful for the small but significant progress Claire had made. And carried 2 steaming mugs of tea outside and set them on the small table by the garden. "I thought you might like a break," she said, her voice warm. Claire looked up, her eyes clear and bright in the morning light. "Thanks," she replied, rising from her spot and brushing soil off her hands. She joined in at the table, sitting down with a sigh of contentment. For a while, they sipped their tea in comfortable silence, the gentle rustling of the leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird filling the quiet. The flowers they had planted were thriving, their vibrant colors standing out against the freshly turned soil. And found herself marveling at how something so simple could bring so much life to their days. "You've done a great job with those flowers," Anne said, nodding toward the garden. Claire smiled faintly, her gaze lingering on the blooms. "It feels good," she admitted. Like I'm doing something that matters." And reached across the table and placed her hand over Claire's. "You're doing more than you know, sweetheart." Claire looked at her mother, her expression softening. "Do you really think so?" And nodded. "Absolutely. Every time you tend to that garden, you're showing me how strong and beautiful you are. It's a reflection of you, Claire." Claire blushed slightly, her lips curving into a shy smile. "Thanks, Mom." The words warmed Anne's heart, and for a moment, the weight of Claire's illness felt lighter. She knew their journey wasn't over, there would still be hard days ahead, days when memories would slip further away and moments of clarity might grow fewer. But this moment was theirs, and Anne held onto it tightly. Later that afternoon, Anne found Claire in the living room, staring at the open sketchbook on the coffee table. She was holding a pencil, her fingers hesitantly tracing over the blank page. And watched from the doorway, her heart swelling with hope. "Are you thinking about drawing something?" Anne asked gently, stepping into the room. Claire looked up, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "I don't know. I used to draw, didn't I?" "You did," Anne said, sitting beside her. "And you were wonderful at it." Claire frowned, staring at the empty page. "What if I'm not anymore?" And placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. It doesn't matter if it's perfect. What matters is that you try. Art isn't about being perfect, it's about expressing how you feel. Claire seemed to consider this, then nodded slowly. She set the pencil to the page, her hand trembling slightly as she began to draw. At first, the lines were tentative and unsure, but gradually, they became steadier. And watched in silence, letting Claire find her rhythm. Minutes turned into an hour as Claire worked, her focus deepening. When she finally lifted the pencil, she turned the sketchbook toward Anne. The drawing was simple but beautiful, a small vase of flowers, much like the ones in their garden. Anne's eyes filled with tears as she admired the sketch. "It's beautiful, Claire," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Claire smiled, a hint of pride in her expression. "It felt good," she admitted. Like I remembered something." "You did," Anne said softly. "And it's a part of you that will always be there." As evening fell, Anne and Claire sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted with hues of orange and pink, casting a warm glow over the garden. Claire leaned against Anne's shoulder, her head resting lightly. "Do you think the flowers will still be here next year?" Claire asked, her voice quiet. Anne wrapped an arm around her daughter, pulling her close. "They will if we take care of them." Claire nodded, her gaze fixed on the vibrant blooms. "I want to keep taking care of them," she said. Even if I forget why." Anne's chest tightened, but she smiled. "We'll do it together, Claire. Every day." Claire closed her eyes, her breathing steady. "I like that," she murmured. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, and felt a deep sense of peace. The journey ahead would not be easy, but moments like this gave her the strength to face whatever came next. She looked down at Claire, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder, and placed a gentle kiss on her forehead. In that moment, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the garden they had built together, and held on to a singular truth: love transcends memory. Even if Claire's mind continued to falter, the bond between them would remain, growing and thriving like the flowers they had planted, fragile, resilient, and full of life. And closed her eyes and whispered softly, "I'll remind you every day, my love. Every single day."